Welcome to A New Life. Today's session, God, Myth or Reality? Way back in the 1500s, man began asking a very poignant question, and that question was this: do aliens exist? Much before anyone ever thought about these aliens though, much before anyone ever searched for these aliens, there has been a question ever since man has ever existed. An ancient question it is, and a very old question, a question that unsettles people, a question that brings a gleam of joy, a gleam of happiness on people's faces, and a question that angers others. And the question is this: does God exist? Nations have warred over this question. People have been killed, conquests have been won, governments have been brought down, homes have been burned. People have fasted, have prayed, have meditated, have thought and thought and thought and thought. But is He for real? Is God real? Does He exist? Many people have put their own views forward. Many have fought for it, many have advertised it, many have marketed their own school of philosophy, many have said this is who God is, many have looked at heroes of the ancient past and said this is who God is. They have looked at the achievements that man has made and looked at certain people and certain heroes and said this is who God should be like. But you see, we do not want any of these man-made heroes. We do not want any of these man-made philosophies. We do not want any of these man-made views and advertisements. We want to know the truth. The unbiased, unmixed, undiluted truth. We do not want concepts or myths or ideas or ideologies or philosophies or enlightenments of some man in a desert or some man in a forest. We do not want to know what some guy meditated over on a beautiful morning on a beachside. We want to know the truth. As true as your mobile phone is in front of you, as true as the garden is there in your house, or a tree in that garden, or a flower in that garden, as true as your vehicle may be in front of you in your house, as true as you are, as true as your friend is or your family is next to you. Is there an existential reality to this God? Is He real? Does He exist? I urge you and I invite you. This is the most important question that you would have ever asked. A question that can make or break your life. A question that can give you false hope, or a question that can give you solid hope if answered right. We're going to begin a journey in the search for God. And as we begin this journey, remember, we are looking for a God who's real, the true God. If He's ever there, or if there is ever someone called the true God. We want to know about that God. Not a God that you imagine, not a God that you have made with your hands, not a God who looks like anything from nature or creation, not a God that looks like the sun or like the elephant or any animals, not a God who is like a human being. We want to know the true God, who has no shape nor form, the true God, who's above everything else, made of physical matter, above everything else. We want to know about that God. And as we begin this journey, I would like to tell you that there is no intention to hurt any religion. There is no intention to hurt any ideas or to hurt any person who's listening on this message or watching this video. The intention is just one: to help you out. To ask questions that people seldom ask today. Questions that are put under the carpet and traditions that are just followed instead of questioning what is real. So I urge you to keep aside your worldviews. Keep aside your bias. Keep aside your religion for some time, and let's look for the truth. Does God exist? Now imagine you are a person that's employed by a scientist sent to search for a tiger. Would you be able to search for the tiger if you have neither known what a tiger is like? You neither know what a tiger looks like, neither have you seen a video or a picture or an illustration or a cartoon of what a tiger should be like. You have not read any description of a tiger. You have no clue of what a tiger is. In fact, the day that the scientist tells you, get me a tiger, I want to do some tests, that's the first time you've ever even heard the word tiger. Think about it. Would you be able to find that tiger? I'm sure it's not. It's not possible to find a tiger without having even a little bit of description of what a tiger is like. But if the scientist said, you know what, there's an animal called a tiger, and that tiger basically has yellow and black stripes. Now you've got some description to move on, right? In the same way, how can we search for God if we do not have any background, any description of who God should be like? What should the ideal God be like? We do not want a bias of religion where each religion has got their own views of who God should be like, and so they've got these views that already support their existing gods. No, that's not what we want. We want to know in reality, if there is a God, what should he be like? What's the ideal God like? What are his qualities? We cannot search for someone we do not know. So let's think of a few qualities. There's a guy called Job who wrote a very interesting book. I'm not going to go into the details of this book, but somewhere in that book, he claims that God speaks to him and God says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." What's interesting is this God who really speaks to him claims to have laid the foundations of the earth. What does it mean? It means that he claims to have created the earth. Now that's someone who we'd really like to meet. If there is a God, we want to meet a God who has created the earth. There's another place, another book, another ancient document which says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. This document claims that God created the heavens and the earth. Now we are expanding the scope a little. It's not just the earth, we are looking at the heavens and the earth. The heavens and the earth is basically the universe, the galaxies, the stars. We are looking for the heavens and the earth. We want to know about that God who's made space and time, who's made the universe. We want the creator of the universe. Another guy called Jerry wrote around 2,500 years back. He says he has made the earth by his power. That's God has made the earth by his power. He has established the world by his wisdom and stretched out the heavens at his discretion. When he utters his voice, there is a multitude of waters in the heavens, and he causes the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He makes lightning for the rain. He brings the wind out of his treasuries. Now, before I proceed any further, there's two interesting scientific facts in that passage there. The first being, he says he stretched out the heavens. That's really, really interesting, because it wasn't until 1929 that Edwin Hubble discovered that the universe is expanding, or is being stretched, if you may say it. But you see, Jeremiah, wrote around 2,500 years back that the heavens, the universe, is being stretched out. Another scientific fact mentioned there is that he causes the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He makes lightning for the rain. He brings the wind out of his treasuries. Now, very interesting where he says the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. Now, that's the hydrological cycle. It wasn't until thousands of years later that man started observing or writing theories about the hydrological cycle. The hydrological cycle basically says that the waters all over the earth evaporate and the vapors rise up, the clouds are formed, these vapors then condense and then fall down as rain or snow or hail or whatever it is, and then that kind of forms the whole cycle of water that we have on earth today. Two scientific facts mentioned 2,500 years back before they were really thought about. But that's not the point of this passage. The point of this passage is the first statement that he makes there. And he says, he has made the earth by his power. He has established the world by his wisdom. If there is a God, we want to know this God who has made the earth by his power. A God of power is who we want to meet. a God who has made everything. At another place, Jerry says something very interesting. He says, "For he is the maker of all things." He is the maker of all things. You see, if God ever has a CV, and if God is really there and he ever has a CV, there's one qualification that's a must on God's CV, and that's this: he has to be the maker of all things. We do not want any other God. We want to know about this God who has made all things. You see, any other sort of God will not do. Any other sort of God would be man-made God. We do not want just a God of love, or a God of war, or a God of romance, or a God of sex, or a God of wisdom, or a God of anything else. But we want to know a God who has made all things. Ideally, God has to be the maker of all things. Any other God is a man-made myth, a man-made fiction, or human heroes that have been idolized down the edges. If God's really there, he has to be maker of all things. And actually, as a direct consequence of being the maker of all things, if God is really there, he cannot be really bound by space and time. That's why there's a guy called Moshe who wrote something very interesting. He said, "Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting you are God." So he says, you have existed before you've ever formed the earth or the world. Before he's ever created anything, he should have existed. And he's always existed. He cannot be bound by space and time. You know why? Because he has made space and time. That's why another phrase that's attributed to God is, "I am who I am," an eternity that always exists. He's always existing. No beginning, no end, no birth, no death, no point of origin, no point of ending. He's always there because he's not bound by space and time. You see, time exists when matter exists. Without matter, there is no time. God cannot be made up of matter, physical matter of the universe as we know it. God cannot be bound by time as this physical world is bound by time. He has to be beyond all of this. There's a word we use for it. It's called eternal. Not bound by space, not bound by time. There's another quality that we would look for in God. If God is really there, he has to be the first cause of everything. The first cause of everything. And he has to be the last end of all things. All things should have come from him, and all things have their last end in him. He has to be the first cause of all things. Some people say he has to be the Alpha and the Omega. That's Greek letters of the Greek alphabet, which mean Alpha is basically the first letter, Omega is basically the last letter. So if God is really there, he has to be the first cause and the last end of everything. He has to be the first and the last. We want to know about this sort of a God who's first cause, an uncaused first cause, the unmoved mover. We want this God. So if God is really there, he has to be maker of all things. He has to be eternal, and he has to be the first cause. But realistically speaking, does such a God really exist? We're not sure. You know, there's another quality that we can look for in God. The picture that you see before you is a picture of Greek gods from Greek mythology. Now, although this Greek mythology was man-made, it makes a very, very interesting point here. You see, there's a whole host of gods which are having power struggles here. They're all fighting with each other. If you notice minutely, they're all fighting with each other. You see, if there's a whole host of gods, there's going to be power struggles. There's going to be fights. It's not possible for God to be more than one point of origin. It's not possible that this whole universe have more than one point of origin. If there is a God, there has to be one God. There cannot be more than one first cause. If you say that, okay, there are these 3 gods or 4 gods or 5 gods or 1 million gods, then who has made the 1 million gods? They cannot just be more than one point of origin. There has to be one point of origin. Just like many apples may come from only one seed. An apple will never come from more than one seed. You see, there cannot be more than one point of origin of anything. And besides, multiple gods really means chaos or anarchy. All cannot create something. All cannot create the universe. There cannot be more than one supreme being. If there is a supreme being, that supreme being has to be one. For God to really matter, He has to be only one, or else we're going to see power struggles. So if God's really there, He has to be singular, supreme being. He has to be the singular, supreme being. There's more. You see, man has managed to be intelligent enough to make computers, robots, bring information of the world at our fingertips. Man has managed to venture into space, make nuclear energy. Man has managed to take computers that at one point in time occupied entire buildings and bring it into our very hands, into small little smartphones. If God is really the maker of all things, if God is really internal and supreme and singular and the first cause, this God has to be super intelligent, more intelligent than all the intelligence in the whole world. Super intelligent, having no counselor, no teacher, no guru. He has to be above every other intelligence in the whole world. He has to be super intelligent. Another quality that we would look for God. Someone once said, as for God, His way is blameless. You see, if God is really existing, there's a very peculiar quality that we would really associate with God. In fact, even in our everyday conversations, a lot of times we would look to somebody and say, what do you think? Am I God? What am I referring to? What are we referring to when we make such a statement? We're referring to the perfection of God. If God is really there, He has to be perfect. Completely, absolutely perfect. No flaws at all. He has to be perfect. And there's two qualities we would look for God. One is love and one is justice. Someone once said, God is love. So if God is love, His love has to be perfect and His justice has to be perfect. If God is really there, He has to be a perfect, perfectly just, perfectly loving God. That's not all. You and I know to speak. If there is a God, He has to be a God who speaks and communicates with us. You see, if you and I know to communicate with each other, if the dogs on the streets know to communicate with each other, if man can communicate and speak to each other and write entire books and encyclopedias, then if there is a God, He has to be a God who communicates. A God who communicates what we want. So let's put all these qualities together. Do you think there is any chance of the existence of a being that's beyond all this beyond all this universe, beyond the physical world as we know it? Do you think there is any chance of there being a maker, eternal, first cause, singular, super intelligent, perfectly just and perfectly loving and communicating God? If God is really there, He has to be maker of all things, beyond space and time, that's eternal. He has to be the first point of origin of everything, that's first cause. He has to be one, only one, singular, the supreme singular being. He has to be super intelligent. He has to be perfectly just. He has to be perfectly loving. And He has to be a communicating God. Does such a God exist? Let's look for evidence. You see, if we need to really look for such a God, if we really need to look for such a being, we need to look for evidence. But the point is, if He's not really bound by space and time, if He's not really part of this world, if He's not really made up of physical matter, how are we going to look for Him? There's a guy called Paul who wrote to a bunch of Romans, and this is what he says. He says, for since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, that God's invisible attributes, are clearly seen and being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. What is he trying to say? He's saying if God is really there, since the very creation of the world, if he's there, he's created the world. So since the very creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen in the creation, in the things that have been made. So let's look around us. It's like a painting. You see, if an artist has really made a painting, and he's a famous artist, you will really look at certain characteristics, certain traits that you will find in every one of his paintings. If there's an author, maybe an author of some fictional novels, you'll see there's a particular style of writing, a particular style of storytelling that is there in each of his novels. If God is really there, then there should be some traits, some characteristics that are very, very visible in the creation around us, in the nature around us. Let's look for the evidence around us. If the attributes are visible, let's search for them. And obviously, the first question that we will ask ourselves is, how did this universe come to be? How did this universe come into existence? How did we come? How did this world come into existence? Now, if you have any background of science, you know that science has come up with a lot of theories, but there has not been any convincing proof about how this universe has come into existence. It's like assumptions that have been made. It's like theories that have been made by looking at certain measurements, certain observations that we can see in the world today. But there's not been any convincing, conclusive proof saying this is how we know for sure that the world has begun. There's one such theory, we call it the Big Bang Theory. And the Big Bang Theory states that there has been a single point explosion. What does that mean? It says that the universe began as a small, dense point which exploded and expanded from being smaller than a pinhead to as large as what we know the universe to be today. The simple question, if there has been a single point that exploded, do we ever see a firecracker that explodes without anyone lighting it? Do we ever see anything explode without there being a cause for the explosion? So if there has been a Big Bang, who banged the Big Bang? Who caused the Big Bang in the first place? Who pulled the trigger? Who lit the fuse? Who made this Big Bang happen? There's a law in science that we call the universal law of cause and effects. And this is what it says. It says that every cause has an effect, and every effect becomes a cause of something else. Now, if there has been a chain of causes and effects for the existence of this world, if there has been a chain of causes and effects that we can say is the reason why this world has ever existed, what is the first cause? There has to be a first cause. You see, for example, ask yourself this question: how did you come into existence? The first thing anyone would say, okay, my parents. My parents had sexual intercourse and I was born. Okay, how did your parents come into existence? Now you can just go up the family line, and depending on what background you're coming from and what's your school of philosophy or what's your scientific background, you'll either say that there has been one couple that has been there at the origin of all humanity, or you'll say that you began from apes. But either ways, let's look at both sides. Let's say you began from apes. How did the apes come into existence? Fine, you'll say some other animal or some other primitive being. How did that primitive animal come into being? Cells, microbes, bacteria, viruses, okay, how did they come into being? A chemical soup, how did that chemical soup come into being? Oh, the primordial earth. Fine, how did that primordial earth come into being? Oh, it just came into being, did it? Oh, from the universe, some things banged together and there was a lump of dirt that came together and we call it earth. Okay. How did that come into being? How did the universe come into being if that was so? The Big Bang, how did the Big Bang come into being? You see, there has to be a first cause. Time as we know it began when the universe began. Space as we know it began when the universe began. If that is so, then there has to be something that is an initiator. We are not really referring to a person necessarily here, but we are saying there has to be something, some power, some entity, something that is there which has initiated the beginning of the universe, which has initiated this universe. There has to be something which has initiated the universe. Now, if from the very beginning of the universe do we have time and space, then someone who has initiated the universe has to be out of time and out of space, having no origin, having no end, having no beginning, never brought to birth, never ending, and most importantly, uncaused. Because let's say, for example, there was another universe before our universe. Then what caused that universe? We can't just go on for all eternity. There has to be a starting point. And scientists are increasingly coming up with claims that there has to be a point. It makes no sense having some sort of a multiverse theory or some sort of a universe-making machine. There has to be a point where everything began. What is that point? Let's look at it. This point has to be uncaused. This point has to be having no origin. This point should have no beginning, no end. This point has never been brought to birth and never ends. We call this point God. The first cause. Uncaused, eternal. No beginning, no end, and having no cause to bring it into existence. The eternal, uncaused, first cause. You may call this eternal first cause, uncaused, an alien, or a power, or some sort of energy. Let's call it God. This is who God is. If God is really there, this is who He is, and we've just proven that this universe would not have come into existence unless and until there had to be something that has caused it. Some first cause of everything. A first cause that's beyond time and space. Because everything has got a cause. What caused the universe? God. You see, the universe has space and time. But before the universe began, there would not have been any space and time. There has to be something beyond space and time to have initiated this universe. That's who we call God. Fine. We are not sure whether He's a person. We are not sure whether He's a power or an alien or whatever He may be, or it may be. For now, we'll just call this the eternal, uncaused first cause, God. There's more. You see, if you look at the world around us, our universe is highly complex and intricate. And many people have used this word, that the universe is finely tuned. You see, there are physical constants that scientists have measured over years. And if any value of any of these constants were changed slightly, no universe would have come into existence, or there would be no life at all. Like, for example, the ratio of electrons to protons is 1 upon 10 raised to 37. The ratio of electromagnetic force to gravity, 1 upon 10 raised to 40. Or the expansion rate of the universe, 1 upon 10 raised to 55. Or for that matter, the cosmological constant, 1 upon 10 raised to 120. You see, if there is one slight change, 1 point change in any of these constants, there will be no universe and no life. So if there is a God, this God has to have not only created everything, but He has to have finely tuned everything. And you see, if you look at the universe today, we see that there are these constants which are there, which are finely tuned so that the universe has come into existence and there is life into existence. Nothing is complex or intricate without having something to have made it that complex and intricate. Nothing is tuned finely just by chance. It has to be someone who's tuned it finely. That's not all. Let's look at our own bodies. Our own bodies are so complex, and one of the most complex components of our bodies is the human DNA. Now, the human DNA is a very intricate and complex computer program, if I may put it that way. If you look at a computer program on a very basic machine level, it's a combination of ones and zeros giving instructions to a computer. Each combination of ones and zeros is basically like a command given to the computer. DNA is not just two characters, 1 or 0, but DNA is a combination of 4 chemicals. They are labeled A, T, G, and C. Now, combinations of these chemicals are basically used to form instructions and commands for assembling proteins. So it would be something like this. Now, when arranged in a proper sequence, this DNA is like an instruction manual of what action each cell needs to take. And each cell of your body has got this DNA. Let's look at this picture. On the left-hand side, there is a picture of a stained glass window. The stained glass window is made up of a lot of small, minute, fine particles of colored glass that have all been put together. My question to you, has the stained glass window come by chance or somebody has made it? Obviously, the resounding answer is going to be somebody has made it. Stained glass windows don't come by chance. Well, look at the picture on the right-hand side. That, my dear friends, is a cross-section of the DNA. And that is why King David wrote in his psalm thousands of years ago, he said, "For you, O God, formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret." And listen to this. "Skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth." Now, the word used for skillfully wrought is the same word that you would use in Hebrew for colorfully embroidered. Isn't that beautiful? But there's more beauty to this. The DNA is 3 billion characters long. 3 billion characters long, my dear friends. And not only that, it's only 2 millionths of a millimeter thick. And you can store information worth 12 sets of Encyclopedia Britannica. That's not all. You take a teaspoon of human DNA and you have enough space to store information for instructions to assemble proteins for every species that has ever existed of animals. Every species of every living animal that has ever existed can be made with that teaspoon of human DNA. And you know what? There'll still be enough space to store the data of every book that has ever been written in the history of mankind. We still don't have computer memory that's that small to store so much information. In fact, the picture that I showed you previously of the stained glass window and the cross-section of the human DNA was given by was put up in a presentation by a very interesting scientist. He's an ex-atheist and in charge of the Human Genome Project, Dr. Francis Collins. And this is what he says. He says, "It is humbling for me and awe-inspiring to realize that we have got the first glimpse of our own instruction book known previously only to God." That's a scientist for you. The guy who was the brains behind the Human Genome Project that really studied the DNA. That's not all. A very well-renowned scientist who was an atheist, Dr. Anthony Flew, he says something even more interesting. He says, "Superintelligence is the only explanation for the origin of life and the complexity of life." I've got a riddle for you. You see, we know that there is no complex code without a complex coder. There's no complex design without an intelligent and complex designer. Think about this. Imagine that there is a print shop. And there is an explosion in this print shop. Imagine the print shop with all printouts of pages and printouts of posters and flyers that are all lying there. And there is an explosion that takes place in the print shop. What are the chances that the bits of paper, of text and matter and different bits of letters that are there, that's thrown up by the explosion, and all the whole pile of ashes will ever come together to form a dictionary? Let's put another question. Say there's a guy called William and a girl called Jasmine. Now, William and Jasmine really love each other a lot, but they go, after they get married, they go for their honeymoon to a very remote, exotic island. They've never been there before, and on the beach, as they walk on that island, beach, on the sand shore, they see their names written. William loves Jasmine. What are the chances that the waves lapped up on the shore of the sea, of the beach there, to really cause William loves Jasmine to be written there? It's impossible. There are no chances. When you have something as complex as the DNA, you are left with no other options. You cannot blame chance for it. You cannot blame evolution for it. There's no other option. It has to be designed by someone, and there has to be an intelligent designer. There's something more. What is good or bad? What is right or wrong? You see, there is a universal moral code. A universal moral code for everything that we are doing. The question is, can there be a universal moral code without a moral code giver? You go to the most remote tribes. You go to the most remote tribal people who are staying far away from modern civilization. And each of them have got a similar moral code. They know it's wrong to kill somebody without any reason. They know that you can't do certain things. They still have got a basic moral code of what's right and wrong. And it's quite similar to what we have. Now, of course, there are lots of other aberrations there, like they'll eat each other, and many of them are cannibals maybe, and many of them do a lot of other disgusting things. But there is a basic moral code, which is there common between them and us. If there is moral code, there has to be a moral code giver. There has to be a moral law giver. Moral code and moral law has not just come by experience. It's not just come by learning. It's not just come by a worldview. It's there inside of you, no matter whether you're an atheist or whether you're a religious man or a woman. There has to be a moral lawgiver. That's the third piece of evidence that God exists. Because there has to be somebody above everything that has created us, that has really given us a moral code and a moral law by which we understand what's good and bad and right and wrong. There's more. A question I'd like to ask you. Look at the world around you. Let's look at two very important qualities that we've already spoken about previously when we looked at qualities for God. We said love and communication and justice are three qualities that are very essential that God should have. Why? Because humans know to love. If God is really there and God's really made all of us, then God should know to love. Humans know justice. If God is really there and God has really made us, He should know justice. And if humans know to communicate, if God is really there and He has made all of us, then He should know to communicate. The question is, before God created anything, who did He love and who did He speak to? Who did God love and who did He speak to? You see, if He loved Himself, His love becomes very selfish. His talk becomes selfish. If there were many gods and he was loving and speaking to other gods, then we've already refuted that. We said there can only be one God. God really makes sense only if he's singular. So there cannot be many gods. But you need more than one person to talk to, don't you? You need more than one person to love. You need to have selfless love that is more than one person. You see, this makes sense. We know that God exists. And if God really exists, he should love and communicate and be just. If he exists and before he created anything, who was he loving and who was he speaking to? Well, this makes sense only if God exists as a relationship or a community. To understand this, let's look at this guy called Raymond. Now, who is he? He's Raymond. What is he? He's a human being. Correct? So, who is he answers the question of what's your person. What are you answers the question of what's your being. This boy's person is Raymond and his being is human. On a very human level, every being has one person, and any two beings of the same type are necessarily two different persons. You will never have two different human beings. John and Jacob, two human beings, but they are also necessarily two persons. You will never have two human beings who are one person. You will never have one human being that's two persons. You will always have two human beings who are two different persons. What about God? God has to be more complex than humans. Super complex, in fact. Infinite, hyperdimensional, more than one person on one being. If God is God, he has to be more complex than man. You see, man is powerful. God has to be infinitely powerful. Man is wise. God has to be infinitely wise. Man is loving. God has to be infinitely loving. Man is Unitarian. One person in one being. God has to be more than that. More than one person in one being. And since man is Unitarian, man would invent gods that are Unitarians or multiple gods. If God is really, if there is a God that is invented by man, this God would either be Unitarian or multiple gods. But if God really reveals himself, he has to be a God who's more than one person in one being. There is one book that claims to be the revelation of God, which reveals a God who's more than one person in one being. This book is called the Bible. And it reveals three persons: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Three persons, one God. Each title specifying a role. All equal, all equally powerful, all equally eternal. They are not three different gods, but three persons in one being. What's his person? Who is he? Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. What is he? He's God. All these persons are equal in power. If any of these three persons are removed, there is no God. They're all united, they're all together. If any person is removed from there, God does not exist. It's like the three legs of a stool, a three-legged stool. If one leg is removed, the stool cannot stand. If one person is removed, God cannot exist. They're all united, they're all together, they're all equal, they're all equally powerful. Their titles specify their roles. Their titles do not make one lesser than the other or one greater than the other at all. All persons of God have a will, an emotion. All persons of God can love. But the question that's going to come up on everyone's mind is why three persons? Why not just two persons? As two persons is a relationship, why not just two persons in God? Well, you see, if there is a two-person relationship, there is a high chance that a two-person relationship can deteriorate into a give and take relationship. And the love can deteriorate to be selfish. So a God who's two persons really does not make sense. Why not more than three persons? A relationship of more than three persons is selfless also, right? There is a choice that each person has in a relationship to leave or to accept, and that's the kind of selfless love that God should have. So if there is more than three persons, say there's 4 persons or 5 persons in a community, in a relationship in God, if any one of those persons were removed, there would still be a selfless loving relationship. And so, that does not make God a single unit. God has to be one and a single, immutable unit. Only 3 persons make sense. Now, this is my explanation, but there will be lots of other reasons why there are only 3 persons in one God. But the point is not why is it only 3 persons. The point is there's no other revelation of God, no other revelation of God in any other scripture that really reveals a God who's more than one person in one being. There's only one place, and that's the Bible. If it's ever done in history of mankind, if there is ever a revelation in the history of mankind, the first time, any time that man said, we have received a revelation of God, it has been in the Bible. 3 persons in one being. But let's go further. Why all this? Why all this? Why God? Why should God really matter to me? You see, in John 3:16, God says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." If God is there and God is perfect, then perfect love and perfect justice have to be there. What is perfect justice? You look at any human government today, and rebellion against any human government warrants the highest punishment according to the powers allotted and available to the government. This is God we are talking about. He is the highest, supreme, eternal, powerful, all-powerful, all-loving God. And so, any rebellion against this all-powerful God means there has to be the highest punishment according to the powers that God has. And that means perfect, eternal, complete, forever, never-ending punishment. Total destruction. That's God's perfect justice. And there's perfect love. Perfect love says that you do not destroy those you love. If God is really there, then the injustice in the world has to be removed because he's perfect and he's got perfect justice. This injustice is what lots of religions and schools of philosophy call sin. What is sin? Some say sin is doing something wrong or hurting somebody. Some even say falling in love is sin. But what is really sin? Sin is basically trying to live your life independent of God. My dear brother, my dear sister, if you're listening into this, we all have a tendency to live independent of God. A tendency to live independent of God. We've got a tendency to do what we want to do. We all want to do what we want to do. This is what we call sin. Not being dependent on God. Sin warrants punishment. Punishment from God. And punishment from God is perfect punishment, perfect justice, because sin is rebellion against God. Rebellion against a human government warrants the highest punishment according to the powers available to that government. Rebellion against God warrants the highest punishment according to the power available to him. That is perfect power. And so the punishment is the highest, perfect destruction, eternal destruction, a never-ending punishment. The problem is all of us have sinned. All of us have sinned in some way or the other. All of us have done something wrong. And if all of us have sinned and all of us have done something wrong, then we know that perfect love does not destroy those that you love. How can God be perfectly just and perfectly loving? For perfect justice, He would have to destroy all of us. But perfect love does not destroy those you love. How can both exist together? And that's why God has come out with a solution. And the solution is this: bring before me one man who is without sin. The blame of each of our sins will be put upon that man. And the punishment, the perfect punishment that you and I should deserve, will be put upon that man. But you see, we can't find such a man because all of us have sinned. All of us have sinned. That's why God, to His chosen people, the Jews, gave like a foreshadow, a foretaste of what He was going to do. He said, you bring before me an animal, a perfect, unblemished animal, and you sacrifice it, and your sins will be transferred on that animal, and the punishment that's due for you would be put on that animal. But you see, an animal cannot be the representative of all of mankind. It has to be a man who represents all of mankind. But it has to be a perfect man. How can we find a perfect man when all of us have sinned? The only way is if God, who is perfect and always perfect, comes down as man, and that's who Jesus Christ is. The second person of the triune God coming down as man and dying for us on that cross as a human being. His human nature died on that cross, not His divine nature, but He died on that cross all the same. He bled for us. He bore His own punishment upon Himself. That everyone who puts their faith in Jesus Christ receives peace. A peace that is beyond any understanding. A peace that no yoga, no money, no luxury, no cars can ever give you. A peace that no amount of meditation that it can ever give you. A peace that does not shake. A peace that cannot be moved. An unmovable, unshakable peace, like a rock. Because now you are made right with your Maker. The burden of sin that we roam around with, my dear brothers and sisters, the burden of sin on our back and on our chest, the guilt of sin is taken away because you deserve punishment and someone else bore that punishment for you. Someone bore the punishment that you deserve. And that someone is Jesus Christ. That's not all. On the third day, Jesus Christ rose again. And when He rose again from the dead, there's enough historical evidence, there's enough scientific evidence for it. There's no time to get into it right now, but He rose from the dead and He's alive. To give us hope that death is not the end. He paid the wages. The wages of sin is death, and He's paid those wages. The wages of sin is death, and He has made the payment. He has paid with His own life. He shed His own blood. And by His blood, we have been saved. What does He ask of us now? Nothing. You see, you and I can do nothing. Nothing to save ourselves from this problem. All He asks us is to put our faith in Him. Because everyone who puts his faith in Jesus Christ receives this new life like never before. A new direction, a new life. One day each one of us is going to die, and when we die we will stand before the throne of God. And when we stand before the throne of God, every thought and every deed will be before Him. Ask yourself this. Will you be innocent on that day or guilty? If you look deep inside yourself, you will know that you will be guilty. But when you put your faith in Jesus Christ, you receive a new birth, a new life. You become born again. A new life. Because the guilt is taken away. The burden of sin is removed. You now stand justified before God. You are made righteous before God. You are made innocent before God. And now there is no more condemnation for you. You can now live a new life that is dependent on God because He pours out His Holy Spirit upon you. I urge you, my dear brother, my dear sister, if whatever I've spoken to you today makes sense, then give your life to Christ. Give your life to Christ today. Put your faith in Him. He's going to change your life. Put your faith in Him. There is no other hope. No one knows when they're going to die. No one knows when you're going to meet your Maker. But when you meet your Maker, are you ready? Are you prepared? If there has not been a sacrifice that has been offered for your sin, you are going to be condemned. The only sacrifice that can be offered for sin is that of a perfect lamb who is a man. And his blood has to be shed. Or else you will have to bear the eternal destruction of the perfect justice of God. There is no time. Time is running out. I urge you, turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ. I want to say a prayer for you today. Father, I ask you, Lord, that you open the eyes and the mind and the heart of this brother or this sister that's listening into this message. And let them come to know who you are. Let them put their faith in you, Lord. Take away the guilt of sin that is in them, Lord. Remove the burden of sin that is in them, Lord. Set them free from their depression, Lord, and their bondages, Lord. Set them free from their sickness and disease, Lord, that they may receive this new life and this new peace. My dear brother, my dear sister, I urge you and I have a request for you. Call out to Jesus Christ. Keep aside disputes, keep aside debates, keep aside arguments that you may have, and I challenge you. Call out to Jesus Christ with all sincerity, with all willingness to change, with all willingness to repentance, and with all willingness to believe if He is really true. And you will have your answers. And you will know that He's real. God is real. God exists. And He revealed Himself to us through the person of Jesus Christ. Think about it today. God bless you.